This lecture will focus on Muslim and non-Muslim relations in practice. We will look at some examples or images from Cordoba and Baghdad, two very important cities for Muslims in the past. In this lecture, we will be looking at the lived reality of interreligious relations in some past Muslim societies. We will look at how some of the ideas and institutions that addressed the question of managing religious diversity in the Muslim context, such as the Zimma contract and Jizya, were translated on the ground. Specifically, we will focus on Muslim Spain in the West and Baghdad in the Muslim East in the early centuries of Islam. Obviously, the situation for non-Muslims under Muslim rule varied from time to time, from context to context, some positive and some negative. Our focus here is primarily on the positive images. Obviously, we are not trying to ignore the negative ones. Let us look at the term. The period of Islamic history from around the 9th century to the 12th centuries might be relevant to thinking about the management of religious diversity from a Muslim perspective. This period marks a time when Islam had spread right across the world and even across to Europe, specifically to the Iberian Peninsula or modern-day Spain. So it's a time that provides us with some insights into the way Muslim caliphs and rulers organized their states and used their powers in relation to people of other faiths in the states they were managing. Southern Spain, or Andalus as it is usually known in Islamic sources, is the classic example to turn to when discussing interreligious relations during this period. The time is so important that the Spanish language has actually adopted a term that specifically refers to the living together of peoples from different religions from this period. The term is convivencia. Convivencia not only refers to the fact of people from different religious traditions living together, but describes a particular kind of tolerance or acceptance of the religious other, a degree of respect for their individual belief systems and religious practices, and positive interactions between the different religious groupings. It is also about sharing of common technologies, arts, and cultural practices. Convivencia has come to describe not only Spain in that period, but other times and places characterized by the same level of tolerance and acceptance. Some of the examples of centers of convivencia in Europe include Norman Palermo, parts of Christian northern Spain, Christian Toledo, and the Islamic Caliphate of Cordoba. Let us look at Muslim Spain or al-Andalus. Here we have two maps. The map on the left side shows the maximum Islamic rule or power on the Iberian Peninsula in green. And the map on the right shows the reconquest of that peninsula by Christians from the early 10th century to the end of the 15th century. Our focus is on the Islamic Caliphate of Cordoba in the medieval period. A historian of this period refers to medieval Spain or al-Andalus as practicing a culture of tolerance. In her book with the title of The Ornament of the World, How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain, she writes, and I quote, "What strikes us today about Al-Andalus is that it was a chapter of European history during which Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived side by side and despite intractable differences." Of the quote. In painting the picture of this chapter of history, she tells an anecdote which I will also draw your attention to. Anecdote is as follows. A medieval Saxon nun learned of al-Andalus from a bishop who was the Islamic Caliph's ambassador to Germany. The bishop explained to the nun that he was one among many prominent diplomats of al-Andalus who were not Muslims. Apparently, the foreign ministry at the time was also run by a Jewish bureaucrat. This anecdote shows us that rather than just tolerance of the religious other, people from religions other than Islam were able to take up positions of power in the Muslim state. Even more interesting is the fact that these state officials from other religions were trusted to represent the Muslim state abroad. The Muslim state did not seem to be threatened by the religious difference of these people. Let us focus on the Islamic Caliphate of Cordoba from 929 to 1031. But before we do that, let's briefly touch on the history of the spread of Islam into the Iberian Peninsula so we get a clearer picture of the influences it was exposed to. The Muslim incursion in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula came after the early period or early spread of Islam across to North Africa. It was between 711 and 1492 that the Iberian Peninsula came under the rule of a number of different Muslim dynasties and powers. While the Muslim power during this period expanded significantly and also contracted often, the most vibrant period of Muslim rule there was probably from 929 to 1031. This is the period of what is known as the Caliphate of Cordoba, which covered much of the Iberian Peninsula. Under Muslim rule, there were large numbers of Christians and Jews. They all contributed to the running of the state. But Muslim power, after the great period of the Caliphate of Cordoba, over time weakened until the Iberian Peninsula were completely taken over by the Catholic Christians by 1492. Even though Muslims, Christians, and the Jews lived together in Spain since the Muslim invasion of the peninsula in 711, many would argue that perhaps the most important period for flourishing of religious diversity, tolerance, and religious pluralism was during the Caliphate of Cordoba, particularly under the rule of Abdurrahman III. Abdurrahman III declared himself Caliph in 929, which actually was an act of defiance to the ruling Abbasid Caliphate or dynasty based in Baghdad at the time. At the time, the basic idea was that there should be only one caliph for the Muslim world, and that caliph was based in Baghdad. Anyone else who ruled parts of the then Muslim world would not call himself a caliph. By declaring himself caliph, Abdurrahman III was pretty much saying that he could rival the caliph based in Baghdad, given that he was ruling over a prosperous, powerful, and extremely attractive place for philosophers, scientists, and scholars. He was in fact creating a rival Muslim power in the West. This period of the Caliphate of Cordoba is also often referred to by many as a golden era of Muslim Spain or al-Andalus. Historians say that both Abdurrahman III and his successor al-Hakam built Cordoba into a true metropolis that became the center of intellectual life in Europe at the time. Because of this, Cordoba became the largest and most prosperous city in Europe. It had a population of approximately 500,000 people. Jews and Christians were given what we call dhimmi status, but essentially had more rights than anywhere else in Europe at the time, particularly for the Jews. Obviously, Europe was predominantly Christian at the time. Jews who were otherwise often persecuted in Europe were given the right to work in finance, trade, and medicine, and many other areas, and they were freely involved in education, commerce, and industry, and also in the government. Christians and Jews were very much part of all aspects of life in this caliphate, just like Muslims. Um, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, all of them produced great works in poetry, philosophy, science, medicine, and the study of scripture. Jews and Christians could mingle with Muslims, and as I noted earlier, all had the opportunity to occupy positions of power in the Muslim government. Let me just provide one example from this period. The example is a very famous Jewish figure whose name is Samuel ibn Nagrilla from 993 to 1056. He was a prominent Jewish general in the 11th century Muslim Spain. He was born and lived in Cordoba until 1013 and then settled in Granada, southern part of Spain. He came to the attention of the then Granada's ruler and became an important court official. And after the ruler's death, he became the chief minister and military commander. Samuel went on to captain Granada's army for nearly 20 years, with many successes against the enemies of Granada. He was Jewish, but was quite comfortable in functioning under a Muslim ruler. He was a great poet and had mastery of Arabic. He was also a master of biblical scholarship and wrote commentaries on scripture, Jewish scripture. He spoke Arabic, he socialized with the Muslim elite, and he was the commander of the army of the Muslim state. But at the same time, he saw himself also as the protector of Jews, given the leadership role he had. He was very powerful and influential. And a Muslim historian of the time, whose name is Ibn Hayyan, conceded Samuel's greatness, even though he was also condemning Samuel for his faith. This is what Ibn Hayyan had to say about Samuel. He said, "This cursed man was a superior man, although God did not inform him of the right religion." Well, this example shows the kind of spirit of convivencia that we are talking about. Obviously, this is just one example, but there are plenty of others. At the same time, we also should say that during these several centuries, the situation for non-Muslims varied also enormously, from positive to negative, and so forth. So we need to keep an eye on both sides. Let's now look at the Abbasid Caliphate. Well, Abbasid Caliphate was from 750 to 1258, several centuries. In the first 2 or 3 centuries of Abbasid Caliphate, the Caliphate dominated regions as far as North Africa to Central Asia, and it was probably the most powerful state at the time. The newly established capital, Baghdad, which was created especially to function as the capital of this powerful empire in the Caliphate, is the example perhaps we should look at when it comes to positive interreligious relations. Abbasids moved the capital of the Caliphate from Damascus to Baghdad. The move was significant. It represented perhaps an openness to many other cultural and religious influences. Orienting the Caliphate further east meant the state was closer to a wider range of cultural influences, making engagement with ideas from India, Persia, China, and also the Byzantine Empire more possible. A new level of cultural and intellectual exchange was facilitated by the move, bringing a general ethic of intercultural and interreligious collaboration in learning and exchange of ideas in particular. Baghdad flourished as a center of Islamic culture and civilization during what is termed the Golden Age of Islam by some. But it is important to note that Islamic culture was not monocultural in this period. What we call Islamic culture accommodated many different cultures, different traditions, and different people. But because Islam was the dominant element in all of this, its presence was felt in all aspects of culture in the Caliphate. Of course, the Abbasid period was not unique in Islamic history in bringing people of different religious traditions together. From the time of Prophet Muhammad, Muslim states brought together Muslims, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Buddhists, and others in major cities and towns, and these people often lived side by side. This kind of living was facilitated to a large extent by the contract of Zimma and the institution of jizya we explored in an earlier lecture. A clearly articulated system of coexistence with its own set of rules and regulations provided the certainty for all people under this Muslim state. In this system, people of different religious traditions were able to maintain their religious identity and still had the ability to engage with the others in commerce, bureaucracy, education, and scientific and intellectual activities. We will look at a couple of examples from this period to show the kind of interaction, tolerance, and acceptance of the religious other during this period. The first example is the famous institution of learning and scientific activities that was established by the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. This came to manifest in an institution called the House of Wisdom, or in Arabic, Bayt al-Hikmah. The House of Wisdom, which was established in the 9th century, is an important institution in Islamic history. It was a scientific academy, a library, and a research institute. It was crucial not just in the history of Islamic learning, but in the history of knowledge production across cultures and religions too. The House of Wisdom was first established by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. It was home to a diverse range of books and texts he had acquired from different parts of the world, which were eventually added to by his successors. When Harun Rashid's son al-Ma'mun came to power in 813, he radically expanded the House of Wisdom, building a wing for each area of knowledge. Each wing was essentially a library of its own, dedicated to one specific area of learning, in Arabic, ilm. For example, there were separate sections dedicated to science, geography, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine. The manuscripts and books that had been collected and stored in the House of Wisdom were in many languages. Some were in Farsi, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. This diversity of languages immediately points to the collaborative process involved and the great desire of al-Ma'mun and other caliphs to engage with different cultures and ideas. Let us now look at the translation movement that is associated with the House of Wisdom. The task of translating the many books and texts that existed in the House of Wisdom into Arabic became very important. In fact, it became the primary function of the House of Wisdom initially, and it was through this process of translation that the Institute of Learning and Knowledge largely promoted cross-cultural and cross-religious collaboration. Translation of these works, many of them were philosophical and others scientific and so forth, into Arabic was primarily to develop knowledge production significantly. By acquiring these works and texts from different regions and cultures and paying large sums of money for acquisition and translation, the caliphs were initiating a knowledge production movement. This was on the ground led by people of different religious traditions as well. They worked side by side, and religious difference was not an issue. The main task of the House of Wisdom initially was translation of these different works into Arabic. The translation was led by Arabic-speaking Christian scholars who were familiar with scientific and philosophical works of, for example, the Greeks. The famous scholar Nain ibn Ishaq, who led the translation project, was the distinguished and influential Christian scholar who specialized in Greek to Arabic translation of predominantly medical and scientific texts. Many others employed were from different religious backgrounds. The House of Wisdom became home to translators, scientists, scribes, authors, copyists, and other learned men and women from diverse backgrounds. This diversity was encouraged and indeed necessary to discuss, translate, and teach the diverse texts at hand. The House of Wisdom saw the translation of some very important non-Islamic and non-Arab authors. They included famous mathematicians, scientists, and philosophers from Greek, Persian, and Indian backgrounds, including figures such as Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and Galen. The translation of these works opened up the opportunity for people from other cultures and languages to read and study their ideas. Of course, after translating these works into Arabic, many scholars from Muslim, Jewish, and Christian backgrounds in particular contributed significantly to knowledge production in medicine, engineering, mathematics, astronomy, music, philosophy, and others, just to name a few. In the history of these disciplines, you will find plenty of Arabic names, but unless one studies who these people are, it will be hard to say whether they are Muslim or something else. Um, of course, given that the majority was Muslim, there would be many more Muslim scholars, scientists, and philosophers. Many of the translated works and original contributions, now written in Arabic, were later translated into Latin in Europe in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, which then again contributed significantly to expansion of knowledge in Europe. The House of Wisdom of the Abbasids demonstrated a remarkable ethic of cross-cultural learning, and it is clear its rulers did not discount the contributions of people from other religious traditions. In fact, it appears they encouraged the idea that knowledge can and should be gained from different places and from different cultures and people from different backgrounds. Let us now look at another example of inter-religious relations in Baghdad. We'll be looking at the inter-religious dialogue between Timothy and the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi. The example is the inter-religious dialogue between Caliph al-Mahdi, who was the Abbasid Caliph, and Timothy, who was the patriarch of the East Syrian Church. It is probably one of the first Christian-Muslim dialogues ever recorded. The dialogue occurred in 781 between the Caliph and Timothy, who was the official representative of Christian churches at the Abbasid Caliphal court at the time. The two were close friends and regarded themselves as equals, despite the fact that the Caliph was perhaps the most powerful person in that part of the world at the time. The Caliph and Timothy sat down to discuss key points of difference between the Christian and Muslim faiths. Examples include who was Jesus, what was meant by the statement that Jesus was God's Son, the nature of Jesus' birth, the Trinity, the direction of Christian prayer, whether the Quran was revealed by God, whether the Christian scriptures were altered or corrupted, who was Muhammad, and philosophical issues like whether God can die. So you can imagine these were quite contentious issues between the two faiths and very key to the core beliefs and identities of both the Caliph and Timothy, and of course Muslims and Christians. The interesting thing about their dialogue was that they talked about these controversial and potentially very difficult issues with a great deal of respect for the other's beliefs. Let me just give a couple of examples. In the first one, Timothy says, "The next day, I, meaning Timothy, had an audience of His Majesty, the Caliph. Such audiences had constantly taken place previously, sometimes for the affairs of the state, and some other times for the love of wisdom and learning, which was burning in the soul of His Majesty, the Caliph. He is a lovable man, and loves also learning when he finds it in other people. And on this account, he directed against me the weight of his objections whenever necessary. After I had paid to him my usual respect, such as King of Kings, he began to address me and converse me, not in harsh and haughty tone, since harshness and haughtiness are remote from his soul, but in a sweet and benevolent way. Um, so even though the two had very different beliefs, they spoke about each other in a way that was respectful of the other and the other's position. Another example from the dialogue was related to the question whether the Quran was revealed by God. Obviously, this is a very important question for Muslims and a very sensitive one. And Timothy is again reporting, and he is saying, and I quote, "And our king, that is the caliph, said to me, 'Do you not believe that our book was given by God?'" Our book meaning the Quran. "And I replied to him, 'It is not my business to decide whether it is from God or not. But I will say something of which your majesty is well aware, and that is all the words of God found in the Torah and in the prophets, and those of them found in the gospel and in the writings of apostles, have been confirmed by signs and miracles. As to the words of your book, which is the Quran, they have not been corroborated by a single sign or miracle. Since signs and miracles are proofs of the will of God, the conclusion drawn from their absence in your book is well known to your majesty." End of the quote. Timothy politely conveys his position as a Christian about the Quran. Well, for him, the Quran is not the word of God. The caliph did not react in an angry or impolite manner. What is interesting about this is that this was happening in the presence of perhaps many other dignitaries of the caliphate. And the caliph is and was the most powerful person in the caliphate. Timothy was not afraid to say clearly what his belief was. The dialogue covered a wide range of topics, and it is very, very long. Here I'm providing only one example. We will look at the dialogue in more detail in the class. An interesting point about this dialogue is the two had tried to come up with various common points between them. So they identified that they agreed, for example, that there was only one God, that there were prophets, and that Jesus was born from a virgin, etc. A second point in this dialogue is that they both approached the other with a high degree of respect for them and also for their beliefs, which are obviously very important to each of them. And at the same time, each presented his own beliefs without compromise. Differences were strongly maintained. The question for us is, why did interreligious relations flourish during this period? Or how did the acceptance of religious diversity that we can see in Cordoba and in the Abbasid Caliphate really come about? Or how did the state's governance facilitate these positive relations? It was perhaps primarily the contract of Zimma and associated rules and regulations, some of which are covered in the Pact of Omar that we should be looking at. The contract of Zimma, I'm sure you can remember, addressed the issue of governing a religiously plural society, people from different religious traditions under the one umbrella. It emphasized the need to offer religious freedom to all. It was this contract that was used as a basis to structure the governance of Cordoba and also Baghdad. And the Jews and Christians of both places and elsewhere in the caliphates formally agreed to the rules and regulations that the contract set out, such as the jizya tax and a whole lot of other rules. Obviously, we are looking at this from the perspective of that time, necessarily from the perspective of 21st century values. Historians argue that it was because of this contract of protection or the contract of Zimma that a culture of diversity was able to flourish. It gave religious communities a secure place in the Muslim state. It meant that religious communities were able to maintain their own religious identities and to recognize others too. They were given a high degree of autonomy, which they valued. Most importantly, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and of course Hindus and Buddhists and many others, were able to socialize with each other without fear of losing their religious identity. And all of them had the opportunity to participate in managing the state as well, of course, based on one's skills. Um, Therefore, places like Cordoba and Baghdad became unique sites of cultural and religious interchange. The point I'm trying to make here is that the religious diversity that was fostered in places like Cordoba and Baghdad allowed a kind of cultural exchange based on respect and recognition of the other. Different religious communities had to live together, side by side, and interact and work together or socialize. The contract of Zimma allowed these interactions, and one did not have to move away from one's religious identity, whatever it was. Does this mean then that there were no major problems or tensions in the application of the Zimma contract or on the interreligious relations front? Obviously, we cannot say that over many centuries and different parts of the world and under many different Muslim states, there were no major problems for non-Muslims under Muslim rule and that it was always positive. We cannot say that. There were periods in Islamic history when such tensions and problems created a lot of challenges and difficulties for non-Muslims. But the point is that the overall picture that emerges is that by and large there was a high degree of tolerance of people of other faiths in most Muslim states. This tolerance and protection for non-Muslims was provided largely by the Zimma contract, which is recognized by all Islamic schools of law. So there is a very strong legal basis for that. Lack of protection then should be seen as a deviation from the norm. So it is true that some Muslim states were not always able to uphold a pluralistic ethic. There are historical examples that clearly show that a pluralistic system of governance was not always adopted successfully. And one can cite a whole lot of examples to support that. But these examples were exceptions rather than the norm. What really dominated was a system that was recognized or that recognized differences in religion and valued people for what they can contribute in terms of skills and abilities. People of different religious traditions had the opportunity to take or to make those contributions without endangering their religious identity. And I think this is an important point. Another related question is, was there in fact a golden era as far as interreligious relations are concerned? Um, some scholars today question whether there was actually convivencia or what some refer to as a golden era, particularly in Spain, as far as interreligious relations are concerned. Some scholars today argue that this is just a myth or a kind of utopia created in order to create a perception of an idea of a society that actually didn't exist in reality. Perhaps the best way to answer this question is by comparing the situation in, for example, Muslim Spain with other cities in Europe at the time. Most scholars would agree that places like Cordoba in Muslim Spain was relatively more tolerant and accepting of the religious other than other places in Europe at the time. It is true that non-Muslims did not have full equality as we understand it today, but that was a norm that was not a norm that was generally accepted or practiced in medieval times anyway. So we are looking at a different set of values at the time. Let us now look at briefly this issue of Spain coming completely under Christian rule. So we are interested in looking at what happened after Muslim Spain came under Christian rule As a point of comparison, almost 800 years after the Iberian Peninsula or Spain came under the rule of Muslims, Christian forces gradually took back control of the peninsula from the early 10th century onwards. In 1491, a treaty was signed between the last Muslim ruler in Granada, in the southern part of Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. This treaty really was a surrender treaty to the Christian rulers. The treaty transferred the sovereignty of the Muslim kingdom of Granada, the last remaining part of Muslim Spain, to the Spanish Catholic monarchs. We will look at the treaty in detail in the class. Under this agreement or the treaty, the Muslims who remained were granted certain rights. They were guaranteed fair treatment. They could keep their properties, including their places of worship, and they were given religious freedom, including the right to pray without anyone hindering or mocking them. In the years that followed, that is after 1491, as other Muslims in the region heard about the rights and freedoms of the Muslims in Granada, many who were under Christian rule elsewhere in Spain decided to relocate to the city of Granada. So the number of Muslims living in Granada increased, which came to the notice of the city's Christian rulers. As the city was only ruled by a small Christian administration, and there were still many Muslims in important administrative positions in the city, the rulers began to feel a little uneasy. They began to feel their power might be threatened, and this changed the dynamic between the different religious communities in the city. So by 1498, just 7 years after the city came under Christian rule, things began to change for the Muslim residents. As the Muslims faced more restrictions in Granada and their autonomy and religious freedom began to be curtailed, they began to rise up against the Christian rulers. The rulers put down these revolts and they tightened up their restrictions even more. The Muslims began to lose many of the rights that had encouraged many to migrate there in the first place. Their mosques were converted to churches, and many Muslims were baptized by force. This caused some Muslims to choose to pretend to be Christians on the outside and to practice Islam in secret. The Spanish rulers termed these Muslims moriscos, which meant more like. Many Muslims who had been baptized were accused of being Moriscos and were expelled from Spain. By the early 1500s, the Spanish rulers decided that the Muslims needed to convert to Christianity in order to continue to live in Spain. Spain could only have one religion, that is, Catholic Christianity. Everybody else must convert or leave. Several edicts were issued which basically made it mandatory for Jews and Muslims to convert to Christianity. Many Muslims fled the region at this time, but some stayed, even though they had no religious freedom at all. No mosques were allowed. They were converted to churches. Prayer was forbidden, and even copies of the Quran were destroyed. Eventually, all Muslims and those who were thought to be Moriscos were expelled from Spain and Spanish lands. Spain became a purely Christian state. It simply could not have any other religion within it. Perhaps many would argue that this was the end of the coexistence for people of different faiths in Spain. In summary, in this lecture, I hope I have given you some insights into a historical period that was a good example of how a society of different religions can function successfully together. We looked at a few examples of this in places like Cordoba and Baghdad.